In this video, we're going to talk about blood sugar spikes. Specifically, we'll talk about who is at risk and why blood sugar spikes are even a health risk, how we can figure out if our blood sugar tends to spike frequently, and what we can do to prevent our blood sugar from spiking. To this end, I'm talking to Dr. Penny Figtree. Penny is a primary care physician in Port Macquarie on the east coast of Australia. She runs a primary care office that focuses heavily on low-carb dietary approaches to treat obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other metabolic diseases. She has plenty of professional knowledge about blood sugar issues from her clinical work, but also some very unexpected personal experiences with blood sugar spikes. If you're interested in good metabolic health, I think you will find this conversation interesting. Okay, Dr. Penny Figtree, thank you so much for joining me today and taking the time. This is going to be a lot of fun. I have met you as it is these days, right, on Twitter, where you in particular have been trying to spread the word on people developing blood sugar spikes in relation to eating foods that commonly are considered healthy foods, and that you've learned from your patients, your own family, from other colleagues, that this is not such a rare phenomenon. So first of all, again, thank you, welcome. Thank you for talking to me. And maybe you want to share a little bit about how you came to learn that you do experience these blood sugar spikes, because you're maybe not the typical patient where you yourself as a physician would consider that this is an actual risk.
Well, thank you for asking me, Mario, and it's fun that we met over Twitter, because you make friends on Twitter, and it was great that you saw my strange porridge spike and you questioned me about it, and I asked about it, and so that's why we're here today, because I posted that spike, which is my blood sugar when I eat a bowl of traditional oats. It shoots up to such a high level that you'd think that I was a diabetic. But I know I'm not a diabetic. I'm healthy and fit and thin and exercise, and my HbA1c is in the healthy range. But anytime I eat porridge, I get this enormous spike. So most people on Twitter would say it's because I eat a low-carb diet and then I've eaten some carbohydrates, and you're a bit glucose intolerant when you're on a low-carb diet. So if you do eat glucose, you will spike. But even when I'm eating a high-carb diet, if I eat oats, I get this strange spike. So I was very surprised to discover this, because I've been a big cereal eater my whole life. I love porridge and muesli, and always thought I was a very healthy person with my muesli every morning. And my husband was always shocked. He hates muesli and cereal, and I was always eating it, even for afternoon tea, or a bit hungry after dinner, I'd be eating my cereal with light milk, because I was always low fat and very healthy. But now I'm a low carb doctor. I treat diabetics, so I was interested in CGMs, and so I thought I'll wear one myself. And I wasn't eating a low-carb diet at that time, and I was eating my bowl of muesli sort of mid-morning, and I saw this spike just shoot up out of the CGM like a straight line. I was actually terrified, and I kept holding the phone up, reading it and seeing. I couldn't believe it, and it went up to almost 12. I was sort of frightened what's going to happen next. And then it just plummeted right down again, and it actually went into the red. And that moment I realized all my life I've been suffering from something called reactive hypoglycemia, which means that you get this very low blood sugar all of a sudden out of nowhere, and you feel terrible. And it's actually tormented me, because I'd be at work and all of a sudden I'd be shaking and feeling terrible. Or I was giving a speech and it happened, and I couldn't think because I was shaking and feeling anxious, and I couldn't think. And that was this very low blood sugar. And in that moment, I realized that's because I eat these cereals that shoot my blood sugar up high. Then my body makes insulin, brings it in, boom, it shoots low. And that's when I get this hypoglycemia. So I never eat porridge anymore. I always make sure I have a healthy breakfast with some eggs and avocado, and I never get reactive hypoglycemia. I feel less tired. I've got more energy. It's actually been life-changing for someone like me who's not a diabetic, never thought I had any problems. That CGM experience has actually changed my life, seriously.
Thank you so much for sharing this. This is actually really a learning experience for me as well, because the types of blood sugar spikes that you and others are experiencing to what we call naked carbs, just a meal that's mostly fairly easily digestible carbohydrates. That's not something that's commonly tested all the time in clinical studies, and so I think this has gone a little bit under the radar, where it's not clear before the age of CGM, at least this current age of CGM, where it's much more widespread that people have one that are not diabetic. I think it's gone under the radar that this is actually a potentially pretty frequent phenomenon, because one thing that struck me is when you published your graph showing how your blood sugar spikes up when you eat just a little bit of oatmeal or porridge, how many people commented that they have the same response on Twitter. And so I was interested. And then you shared, I think, a blog post from an Australian registered dietitian who...
Well, actually, it's Lily Nichols. She's American, I think.
Oh, she's American, actually.
Yes, and I Googled this oatmeal CGM, and then her blog came up, and she described exactly what had happened to me, how she was watching that shoot up, terrified. And she's a dietitian she's a low-carb dietitian. She specializes in pregnancy and gestational diabetes.
Should we take a look at maybe some of these examples that you shared so that
yes,
you can see?
so people understand.
Right? Is it just the oatmeal, or is it other things as well? And maybe you can comment on that as we go
I know. Well, that's right. So there's me with my traditional oats, and people would then say, well, what about steel cut oats, which is, still spikes my sugar. And then white rice. Again, if I eat it with a fatty meal, it doesn't do it. But if you have white rice by itself, again, it shoots right up. And interestingly, I did email Professor Snyder from Stanford, who studies CGMs, and he said everybody spikes to white rice and some people spike to oats. So I spike to both of them. This is a breakfast out at a cafe. I didn't have the pink berry smoothie. I just had that mixture there, and it had coconut yogurt with it. I thought, well, that might slow the absorption down, and that was bircher muesli, so it's soaked. But again, I still just shot. It must just zoom in so fast that it still went up to 10.2 there.
This one actually has been a bit of even more of a shocker to me, because
really,
particularly this mixture, right, with whole fruit. It looks like there's some nuts on there as well, and if you say coconut yogurt, that's some fat at least. I would not have thought that a healthy person, and let's just clarify, as healthy, we're defining someone who doesn't have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes by normal clinical standards, right? So if you did an oral glucose tolerance test on yourself, or looking at your HbA1c, there's no evidence of pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Yet you're seeing these massive spikes. And what's interesting about this is that, we'll see this in a little bit as well, your blood sugar shoots up, like a rocket, but then it actually drops down, which means all of that interesting action is happening in about the first hour, maybe even first half hour after eating the meal. And that means even if you went into the doctor, your colleague, and they said, oh, let's do an oral glucose tolerance test, this may be entirely missed, because usually in an oral glucose tolerance test, clinically, you just do blood draws at 0 minutes, right before you drink the beverage, and then again 2 hours later. And that's standard in clinical care as well, in clinical trials as well, most of the time. And so you miss entirely that there's this huge spike in between.
Because it's so quick. It reaches that peak very quickly, and you as if you'd be able to catch it with the blood test. Yeah. Even if you tried to catch it, you probably wouldn't.
It's really fascinating. So I have to be honest.
And also, everyone always says fiber. If you eat it with fiber's rubbish. Look at all that fiber. It didn't do anything. Porridge is full of fiber. No, that's fiber.
I would say for me, fiber makes a bit of a difference. But what it seems like is just there's a lot of variability between people,
Yeah.
and I think that is something we really need to acknowledge if we want to get to the space where people actually can avoid these types of spikes, right? Because we can talk in
Yeah.
a little bit about whether this is actually concerning, mildly concerning, or very concerning. But I do think there's definitely a variety of different ways that people can try to minimize these types of spikes. But
Yeah.
let's maybe move first to this point that you suggested, or that you hinted at earlier. Let me just find that slide, where you said that you found that whenever you spike like this, so this is what these two graphs show here. So you have a massive spike, and if you really look at it, it's basically within 15 minutes, and then it takes maybe another half an hour, and you're hypoglycemic. So your blood sugar is actually below 70, well below 70 milligrams per deciliter. All these data that you shared here, they're in millimoles per liter. For the viewers that are used more to milligrams per deciliter, you just multiply the millimoles per liter by 18, then you get to milligrams per deciliter. And so you've found that commonly you develop this type of reactive hypoglycemia.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
one thing I wanted to ask about this is, do you find that this is something you always feel, like since you've been wearing the CGM, that you can tell absolutely when
It doesn't
you're
always happen.
doesn't always happen, okay?
Yes. It's only
But
sometimes.
it happens frequently
Yeah.
enough though that it's certainly something you feel now, that you no longer have these spikes because you avoid these types of foods.
Yeah, I used to worry about it. Like if
Mhm,
I had to give a talk, I would be really worried it was going to happen. And
okay.
I do things that I now know were very bad, like drink a glass of orange juice and have some biscuits before to make sure it didn't happen. And that was probably then it would happen. I
Mhm,
distinctly remember giving a talk and I couldn't think. I thought I was going to faint. And my kids were there. And afterwards they said, "What was wrong with you at the start, Mum? Like you were really strange." And I was literally out of it. It was terrible.
oh yeah.
And that was because I was trying to prevent it. So now if I have to give a talk, I make sure I'm in ketosis,
Mhm,
like really low carb. So I know
mhm,
it won't happen. But it never happens now. Never. Because I don't eat naked carbs. I wouldn't eat cereal. Always protein and fat. And, if I eat carbs, just a little bit. So um, definitely. And I remember having to vaccinate. It was after lunch, so whatever I had for lunch must have done it to me. And I was vaccinating someone, and I was shaking as I was drawing up the vial so much, and I could barely see as I was injecting it into their arm. So these are all memories that I
mhm,
have that it's affected me, and I think it might have. I think maybe sometimes it makes me feel tired because have much more energy now. I used to be tired all the time.
mhm,
But the shaking thing it's fixed. So whenever I hear reactive hypoglycemia, I think, oh, those people, all they need to do is eat low carb and they'll be fixed. That's
mhm,
the cure. And I wonder if someone did an experiment with, like, found people with reactive hypoglycemia and put CGMs on them, if
mhm,
this is it. This is
mhm,
why they are getting it. They must make too much insulin when they eat carbs, and if they don't, they'll be cured. I
mhm.
don't know what you think. You're the PhD.
So no, I do think there's actually now data coming out suggesting that exactly these hypoglycemic episodes. I mean, they by themselves are not good, right? So what you're describing, I think, is a real thing, that people are tired an hour and a half after a meal rich in carbohydrates. I think this is really common. I actually have this as well. Like if I eat just like a big sandwich or something, and really no real protein to speak of, or no real fat with it. I tend to get sleepy after lunch. I used to do this at work, and I just couldn't work effectively anymore, and I was looking for a place to nap. No kidding, because I was just sitting there like a zombie a little bit, like you're just staring at the computer, and I couldn't work. So I can absolutely relate, even though I may not have it, as substantial as what you have here. Even though I've actually never had a CGM at the time. Who knows, My
Mm,
most recent experience with a CGM is suggesting that I don't have these extreme spikes and hypoglycemic episodes. But even I experienced it. And so, just for the viewers, if someone experiences this, like, what would be your suggestion as a clinician? Like, should they get a CGM, or should they just, you know, to see if they actually have this type of spiking pattern followed by hypoglycemia? Or would you say it's just indicated that they try out for a while to stay away from these, naked carb, highly glycemic foods that tend to give them that type of response?
Well, I guess in a perfect world, I would suggest getting a CGM because you understand exactly what's going on. Why wouldn't you do it?
Mm-hmm.
But it costs in Australia. You don't need a prescription. You can just go to the pharmacy, but it's still $100. It only lasts 2 weeks. So if you're feeling rich, I usually say to people, when it's your birthday, get everyone to pool together and get your CGM because everyone loves them. It's fun. It's a fun thing to do. So I would say if you can do it, because why would you not discover what's going on and how you respond to different foods and eat what you always eat and see what's spiking you and what isn't spiking you. But if you can't afford it, then of course just experiment by cutting out carbohydrates or refined carbohydrates or mixing them up and seeing if you get better. But if you Google reactive hypoglycemia, they say things like, they said lean meat or something ridiculous. They don't just say, guys, it's refined carbohydrates, eat fat and protein with every meal. That's all it is. They sort of list all these odd foods, and so you don't really understand. But I'm sure that's what it is.
So to stick with the theme of reactive hypoglycemia, there's some research now coming out. Sarah Berry comes to mind, for example, her paper published probably a couple of years ago, where they showed that this happens actually pretty frequently in people, and that this predicts that people get hungry again sooner after that meal, and also then eat way more at the next eating occasion. So aside from any potential negatives of the spike, the hypoglycemia itself almost certainly is not a good thing, because it may lead to this type of eating, and then you feel down, and then your body kind of craves food again, and you overeat potentially at the next meal, and then maybe it all starts again depending on what you eat, right?
Well, then you're rushing to the tea room to find a cake to relieve the symptoms. Like I'd be always in the tea room getting a biscuit.
Yeah.
But interestingly, because you told me, why don't you try eating 2 eggs before the porridge?
All right, let's take a look at that. I think that's very interesting. Let me see if I find it. So this is your traditional oats example that you shared, where 35 grams of traditional oats is not that much, but you got a pretty substantial spike. As we saw earlier, it's about 200 milligrams per deciliter. And then you tried the same thing again, but you first ate 2 boiled eggs and apparently a little bit of avocado, yeah?
Yes. And then I had the same porridge. So I was cooking the porridge while I ate my eggs and avocado, and then I ate the porridge. Now, so I didn't get the spike, but do you know I was so hungry at work? So even though I didn't get that spike, I mean, it still went up a bit, didn't it? I felt hungry at work. I was sitting at work thinking about food and getting that feeling in my stomach I wanted to eat, which I never get when I just have eggs and avocado. And I could tell the difference in the fullness. So, and I don't think that was placebo because I'd forgotten all about it. But I was at work going, why do I feel like I need to eat lunch? Because normally I don't even need to eat lunch. But I'm thinking, gosh, I might go and eat that biscuit. There's always biscuits in the tea room.
Did you, though? You wanted to share another study by David Ludwig's group, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I love this study. I don't know if you've read his book, Always Hungry.
No, I haven't.
It's fantastic. That helped me become a low-carb doctor, the first few chapters. And he did a study in adolescents, and he fed them an omelette one day, another day steel-cut oats, and then another day more refined oats, same calories. And then in the afternoon, they're allowed to eat as much as they want. And when they ate the refined oats, they ate 600 calories more than when they had the omelette. And they also measured their adrenaline and stress hormones mid-morning, and they were really high after the refined oats, much higher than after the omelette. So there's huge differences in the physiological reactions to foods. So talking about calories just seems just a waste of time.
I agree. I feel like calories, if you eat well, the calorie part will take care of itself, right?
Yes.
And that's, I think, what we both agree on. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I didn't actually know about that particular study, but I'm in general aware of this line of research and do think it's quite important. So maybe we can go back to let me see here. So I wanted to share this particular example here where
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? Funny.
this is a real interesting one where you shared that you had a sugar spike, pretty substantial one, to eating chocolate cake, and maybe to most people that's not surprising. No one thinks they're eating chocolate cake and doing their health a huge favor. We're eating it for other reasons, right? But then on this particular day, you had actually eaten the same or similar serving before. Do you want to comment on it?
Yes, so we went out for dinner for lunch for my daughter's birthday, and then back to my mother's house where we had chocolate cake. And then when we went home, she gave us some of the chocolate cake to take with us. So I ate it when we got home before I went to bed, or I don't know, later on in the day. But as you can see, I went out. I had salmon and sort of black rice with a salad and a coffee, and then we went home, ate that cake, and I didn't get a spike at all. But then when I ate the chocolate cake by itself later on, it obviously either got absorbed much more rapidly, and my body couldn't get that glucose down fast enough. So it went right up. So obviously what you eat with your glucose molecules makes a big difference.
Yeah. So this is, I think, this video will be out for people to check out once I publish this one here about how to eat highly glycemic foods, maybe in combination with other foods, or take other measures to kind of avoid these types of massive blood sugar spikes.
Yeah. And previously I've eaten a croissant by itself and I spiked, but when I had it with ham and cheese, it didn't.
Yeah, I think again that's where the CGM is particularly good, where you can actually detect those patterns for yourself and figure out, oh, somewhat surprisingly, this food actually gives me a blood sugar spike, and this is how I feel afterwards, and other foods maybe don't, and I think that way you can a little bit more effectively learn for yourself what works and what doesn't work as well, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel about this? So I had a video actually where I shared that I think there's also a risk with CGM, and that is that we start to obsess maybe a little bit too much over every little increase in blood sugar, because that's something I see as well now, where there's some people on social media sharing that your blood sugar goes up 20 milligrams per deciliters, let's say from 100 to 120, and they share this and say, oh, this is a blood sugar spike, and this should be avoided. I am somewhat critical of this, thinking that this can quickly lead to us developing somewhat of a negative relationship with most foods, because almost everything we eat, if it has any carbs, can give us a little bit of a bump, right? Do you have any opinion on this? Do you see any of this in your patients, or how do you handle this with your patients?
Yeah. Luckily I don't. My patients are all sick, so they're not gym junkies. They're not into taking a supplement. They're sick people on a million pills who've all got diabetes and they're sick. So I haven't seen it in any of my patients. I did see that discussion on Twitter. There was Nick Norwitz did a study with Harvard medical students using CGMs, and there's a lot of people being a bit mean about that study, a bit patronizing, which I thought just reflected poorly on them because it was great. I think it's paternalistic to almost say you can't handle the truth, I think if people want to, they should be allowed to, but perhaps we need better education around it, going, this is normal, this is healthy, just keep it under 140, I think, mostly under 7.8 is fine. I think those sorts of people are probably going to get neurotic about everything in any case. They're already neurotic that they're doing that. But in not letting people have it, you're not then letting people like me figure out what's a lifelong problem and fixing it. But I understand that point, but I think if people should be able to do it, and we shouldn't be holding it back from them if they don't want to. Just
I agree.
Educate.
Yeah, I'm not against, I'm not at all in favor of controlling its use or anything like that. I just feel like there's a fine balance between finding real problems, and I think a
Yes.
spike to 180 or 200 in someone who's healthy repeatedly, particularly if something like oatmeal, you eat this every day, that's not a good thing. But, a little bump, let's say if you eat a whole meal and you have a little bump, personally, I think if it's below 140, maybe even 150 milligrams per deciliter, we shouldn't worry too much about it unless there's something specific that makes you feel bad, as you described earlier.
Yeah.
Like if if your blood sugar seems fine, but you still are just incredibly hungry and you're searching the house for ice cream and potato chips, listen to that as well. But I just feel like agonizing over every little increase or every little change in a single biomarker like that can also have potential negative effects, is what I'm
Yes. Yeah.
coming from, right? Because I
Yes.
feel like I would actually want people to develop a positive relationship to their food and not just see all food as enemy that
Yes.
can give them kind of a negative effect on their health, right? I think that's potentially damaging as well.
Yeah. That's
Okay,
true.
so,
No, I guess there's a balance somewhere there.
yeah, I can absolutely appreciate though that if you're seeing people who have metabolic disease, diabetes, fatty liver disease, then you have a very different perspective on this, and you feel like maybe people should obsess a little bit more about their diet and what it does to their
Yeah.
health. I can,
And interestingly, you brought up the fact, people who eat low carb and then they go and eat a pizza on a Saturday might not be realizing how harmful that is. So a CGM might be good for them because they'll go, whoa, I can't do that. I've got to either eat mixed meals or stay
yeah,
low carb all the time.
yeah, exactly.
So,
Okay, so
yeah.
do you have anything you'd like to kind of conclude with in terms of
Oh, I wanted to mention a patient who was sent to me with pre-diabetes with an HbA1c of 5.8%. I live in a small town. I actually saw her at the fruit and vegetable shop. She waved at me, I'm coming to see you. I've got diabetes. There she is. She was told that she almost had diabetes. And she's an older woman, but very slim and healthy. And she'd been to the dietitian who said, "Girl, I don't know why you've got that. You've got eating a perfect diet." So she came to see me and I took her history and I asked her what she was having in the morning. And she was having a smoothie with berries, light milk, some plain yogurt and Ensure, which is a protein powder. She was putting that in because she thought she needed more protein. And I thought, I bet you it's that smoothie. So I said, put on a CGM, which she did. And that's exactly what it was. With her smoothie, she was spiking to 11.8. And we just got rid of that. And that was the end of the pre-diabetes. Her HbA1c went back to 5.5%. So I also wonder, people put her on metformin, she'd be put on medication, blah, blah. And it's just like, have you looked at what's in Ensure? I don't know if you have Ensure.
Yeah, we've used it in
Like,
clinical trials sometimes, and I'm not a fan of these types of
yes, it's starch, cornstarch, and
Mhm.
sucrose and weird stuff. Yes, so smoothies are not. I whenever I hear the word smoothie, I sort of cringe because I think that's going to put someone's blood sugar right up because you're drinking it and it's so quickly absorbed. So there's GMs, Mario. I think they're great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for people, I think this is a really good practical tip as well. If they have newly diagnosed prediabetes or diabetes, maybe not panic right away, but maybe just look closely at what you're actually doing. Because if you do something repeatedly like this, that will raise your average blood sugar and could be reflected in your HbA1c, as you say, right? And
Yes.
I mean, it's almost tragic that if someone drinks a smoothie like this for breakfast, thinking this is a healthy meal, and that is actually what gets her blood sugar into the pre-diabetic range.
Yes.
It's great that you're raising awareness about this and helping individual people actually become clear about this and avoiding these types of issues. And I think this could be a huge gift that you're giving to them over the long run. So this is wonderful. So I do think we've covered some of the key points, right? That you're definitely an advocate for CGM for someone who can afford it. I think I wrote a blog post for anyone who's interested in this, about is it normal to have these types of blood sugar spikes, and what does the literature say there? And the literature actually does say this is fairly common. This does happen, but we don't usually see it in very young, lean people. So if someone, say, a 20-year-old athlete and they're just very active, it doesn't usually matter what they eat. Usually those individuals rarely ever have blood sugar over 140, 150 or so, is what the literature suggests. But it does suggest that as we get older, that it potentially messes with us. I'd certainly say that if you eat a low-carb diet, it's likely that, as you said before, that, let's say, if you eat low-carb breakfast and lunch, and then you eat cake in the afternoon, right? The breakfast and lunch actually acutely make you a little bit more glucose intolerant. Many people don't know this. But also, if you have an HbA1c that's, say, in the pre-diabetic range or even on the high end of the normal range, if you're older, if you have a higher body mass index, I think you're particularly a candidate for potentially having these blood sugar spikes. And then I think you may want to consider getting a CGM maybe at least for a couple of weeks to see, do I actually have these types of issues, and then you can do something about it. So I do think that could be very useful for a lot of people. All right, Penny, this was a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. I really did enjoy this a lot. Really appreciate your time and insights and expertise in this area. And as always, people are welcome to to write in and ask questions, leave your comments, and we'll do our best to respond to those. So thank you again very much.
Thanks, Mario.
To sum up our conversation, here are the key points we covered. First, some people have distinct blood sugar spikes to some specific foods. As I explained in the last video, I define as a blood sugar spike any increase to 180 milligrams per deciliter, that is 10 millimoles per liter or more. Second, this can affect even people without prediabetes or diabetes. Third, spikes are mostly seen in response to eating naked carbs, that is, meals rich in high glycemic index foods that consist mostly of carbohydrates but little protein and fat. Fourth, blood sugar spikes seem to be more common in people who are older, have overweight or obesity, or who have HbA1c on the high end of the normal range or higher. Also consider that you may have blood sugar spikes if you are frequently tired, jittery, or faint an hour or two after a meal, as these could be signs of low blood sugar following a spike. And this brings us to the fifth point, namely that blood sugar spikes are clearly not a good thing. They may lead to reactive hypoglycemia in some people, and repeated blood sugar spikes are likely also a risk factor for chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and cancer, independent of other blood sugar-related measures such as HbA1c and fasting glucose. Sixth, wearing a continuous glucose monitor for at least 2 weeks is a great tool to detect whether you have blood sugar spikes and to which foods. And seventh, if you spike, either avoid the foods that trigger the spike or use one of the strategies discussed in our separate video. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like below. Also, make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you are interested in all things nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic diseases. Many thanks to Dr. Penny Figtree for taking the time to speak with me and for sharing her personal and clinical experiences. If you'd like to connect with Penny, you can find her on Twitter at Penelope Figtree and on her website, as well as her Facebook page. I'll leave links to all of her contact information in the comments section below. Take care. Bye-bye.